Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Talks at Google. I'm Waz. I'm moderator for today. I'm a user experience researcher with Google One most of the time, and the rest of the time, I'm a self-proclaimed food researcher dedicated to celebrating traditional techniques, recipes, and preserving culture through sharing meals and advocating for local restaurants in the Bay Area. My passion lies within the history of San Francisco's cuisine culture and the chefs who bring it to life. So today we have Kristina Cho, a James Beard Award nominated cookbook author and culinary content creator. Her culinary perspective is rooted in her experiences as a first generation Chinese American growing up in Cleveland with a restaurant family. And now she lives in the San Francisco Bay Area where she's working on her next cookbook and continues to share recipes on her blog and Instagram page, Cho Food. Her cookbook, Mooncakes and Milk Bread, which I have right here, features over 80 recipes and highlights an impressive range of items that can be found inside Chinese cafes and bakeries, including but not limited to sweet and savory baked buns, steamed buns, Chinese breads, whimsical cakes, juicy dumplings, and Chinese breakfast dishes and drinks. This cookbook is the first English language book to extensively cover Chinese baking and celebrate the sweet facet of Chinese American culture. So if you're interested in buying the book, check out the link in the YouTube description down below. Now join me in welcoming Kristina Cho for today's Talks at Google.
Hi, thank you for such the kind introduction.
Yeah, of course. So happy to have you here, Kristina. And so now let's talk a little bit more about where you started and dive into talking more about your book as well.
Sure. I guess I could start with like my life in Ohio, or I don't know. Whenever I talk about my story, it always kind of starts with like a few generations before me. But let's see. So my grandparents, both sides of my family are actually from Hong Kong, but my mom's parents immigrated to the United States in the late 60s, bringing my mom and her four siblings with her. And the first career path that my grandpa went into when he moved to the United States, as a lot of immigrants do, as working in restaurants. So I think that was kind of like the first stepping stone of how I found my way working in the culinary world as well.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and like over the years, he was able to open up his own restaurants. And so from the time I was born until 10, that was like his last restaurant before he retired. So my childhood was essentially spent at the restaurant, running around, asking for snacks all the time. And just, I feel like I wasn't totally paying attention to what was going on in the kitchen, but I was around it and just always loved the energy and just the culture that goes on at restaurants.
Yeah, that's amazing. And what were some of your favorite dishes growing up that you can remember?
There's so many. Like, so specifically at the restaurant, one of my favorite snacks that I would ask after school, I would go to the back of my kitchen, find like my dad or my grandpa, whoever was back there, and ask for like a freshly fried egg roll with sweet and sour sauce. It was a pretty luxurious after school snack, but I love those. They were just like the best egg rolls ever, like a really nice, like thick, chewy skin. And the filling, like I was kind of a picky eater as a kid, and it was like filled with vegetables, of course, and I would just kind of scoop it out. just eat the wrapper that was gently seasoned with cabbage. Like that was essentially my snack. But I love that. And my mom was kind of the primary cook in our household. And she just had like a bunch of, I think because she's been in America since she was 6, she's created a lot of really interesting, like what I like, the definition of Chinese American food is so different for everyone, but it was like her interpretations of American food in like the 70s with like an Asian twist. Like she makes this like spaghetti that doesn't have any like real tomatoes in it. It's like ketchup and oyster sauce and ground beef. And I just thought that that's how spaghetti was made forever until I went to like my friend's house. But that's one of my favorite dishes. It just like you get like a very specific craving for it.
Absolutely, yes. And so besides, that special spaghetti sauce, were there any techniques that you learned from your grandparents or your parents that you still use today?
I think I there's so much about the way that my family taught me how to prepare food that I find myself implementing like on a day-to-day basis, like from as simple as just like making rice. I don't know, like, I feel like one of my earliest memories was, like, standing on a stool and, like, learning to wash rice, like, 3 times, in the sink and stuff, and, like, how to measure rice with my hand, even though I feel like that's, like, very, varying depending on person to person and hand size and, like, all that stuff. But then, I think, like, the most fundamental thing, like, it's not necessarily a technique, but it's just, like, the idea of just, like, family style cooking, like making
Mhm.
enough for like unexpected guests. Like it's really like I just live with my fiance and my dog, and it is very difficult for me to just cook for just two people. It's something I've had to
Yeah.
learn to do over the years, but like I feel like my heart and soul is like meant to cook for like 8 people at any given time.
That's wonderful. And
Yeah.
so yeah, talking about cooking for your family, especially with multiple people, what was like the hardest dish that if you can remember that you had to make with your family?
Oh, I think the hardest dishes are so my grandparents on my mom's side, they're from Toisan. And so a lot of the recipes
Mhm.
that, or a lot of the meals that they make, my grandma makes, are more like Toisan specific regional dishes. And I think those are the ones that are hardest for me to kind of replicate because they're just so specific and the details are so different than kind of like the general like Cantonese style cooking that like I'm more used to at my parents' house. Like my grandma makes like the best jong, which are those like kind of sticky rice. I mean, people call them tamales, but like they're like wrapped in like bamboo leaves and stuff. And like I've
Mhm.
learned how to make those, but they're so labor intensive and require so many steps. I feel like she has like some traditional like Toisan recipe or dish that she makes for like every season of the year, occasion, holiday, or something like that. And I'm just slowly
Mhm.
working my way through learning how to make them too.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's funny how it is kind of like a tamale, you're right.
Yeah,
I never
yeah.
thought about that before.
I didn't know how else to call it, although, like, yeah.
Yeah. But you're definitely right. It is, it is.
Mhm,
So yeah, on your online blog, you explain how you started off studying architecture at the University of Cincinnati, where you realized that cooking and baking in between building models and staying up all night was like your happy place. And you
mhm.
also mentioned in your book that you would feed your friends at weekly dinner parties with minimal ingredients and baked midnight muffins to de-stress. So can you tell me a little bit more about this like hipster supper club in your professor's artist studio, which so fascinates me? Like, how did the supper club start?
Yeah, it all sounds very funny when you, like, list all those things like that. But yeah, so yeah, I studied architecture at the University of Cincinnati, and, like, architecture school, if anyone has somehow have a background in it or even has a background in design, I feel like there's, like, a specific bond that you develop in, like, studio culture with your classmates. And so I still talk to a lot of the people from my architecture school, still really great friends with them. But during school, we just kind of, found any excuse to like not be in studio and like not work on
Mhm.
our models and stuff. And for some reason, I just found my people. I found my people that like really love to eat and cook together. And so, yeah, like every week we would find a different location, like someone else's house to cook like a big dinner together. I have like a very specific memory where I remember like at the end of the week I made like a big pasta dinner. I had like two giant, I had like two really big eggplants. I just like made a bunch of like eggplant parm, like stacks for everybody, and,
Ooh.
and cooked like every shape of pasta that I had available because I needed to feed all these people. But that was a pretty common occurrence, also potluck style. And I think over the 4 years I was there, I got a little bit of a reputation of just like being the person that like wants to cook for other people. And it was actually, I think it was at the end, yeah, my first supper club or like supper club experience that I created was like during my senior year. I did a couple. I'm trying to keep them straight. But I started then, and the first one was I was actually helping out someone else's project. I don't know if they were doing like a furniture project or something like that, but they had built a table that had a built-in like grill on top. Like,
Mhm.
it actually burned. Like, it was not a great table. But the
Oh my
the
gosh.
aspect, the point of the project was that they wanted to create this table that you could cook on, prep on, and then like enjoy on like the entire thing. And so I was kind of like brought on as the person that kind of helped curate the menu for that. And we did this in like
Wow.
the parking lot of one of my professors' like artist studios. Um, and we have these. They look incredibly hipster, just like cooking. It's like embarrassingly hipster, just like cooking on this like wooden table that's like slowly burning in this like kind of industrial lot. But we did a lot of grilled vegetables. I remember making like a dessert that you could cook into a foil packet. Um,
Mm.
and so that was one of them, and then eventually I made my way into the building and actually had, like, electricity and some running water, and I had another supper club then. I only did a couple of them because they were pretty labor intensive, but they were very, very fun.
Wow. I mean, that sounds
Yeah.
fascinating. Did they ever actually make that table? Like, did they ever
No,
sell it?
they did
Like,
not.
okay.
They did not. It literally turned into a bonfire at the end of
Oh,
it where the table was just like you didn't line it with anything. It was like I think there was like literally charcoal and then like a layer of aluminum foil and then like wood. Like they didn't like think about putting anything in between. That wasn't my project. My job was only just to make food and we made food. So
wow. Well, if
yeah.
you can cook
Yeah.
there, you can cook anywhere.
Yeah, I've definitely cooked in a few yeah, I've cooked in places without power and water. Even on my book tour, on my book tour, I've had to do demos in very limited kitchens or limited spaces that aren't necessarily meant to be kitchens. So I think that has prepared me to be a pretty nimble cook on the road, I guess you could say.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. So from those supper clubs, did your friends at this time ever ask you to do special events for them?
I think on occasion I've had people ask me to do like I would consider like intimate catering for like I've done my a couple of my friends got married over the pandemic and so they had like pretty
Mhm.
intimate weddings and so I've created like kind of like these like pack and go dinners for them with instructions for how to like warm up and stuff and occasionally I'll agree to make someone's wedding cake. I was like very
Oh.
much into cake decorating for a little bit and have done it a few times, but I only do it for very special friends now because
Oh.
making a wedding cake for someone's like very special day with everyone looking at it is a little too much anxiety for me to handle. Yeah.
Yes, I could see that.
Yeah. But
Definitely.
otherwise I find a happy place with just writing down recipes for people to make themselves. That's a lot more enjoyable for me.
So was that kind of like the first iteration then, like before the cookbook, right, was a reality? Were those moments, like a stages for you to practice before writing the cookbook?
I think so. Like, I feel like up until I started writing my cookbook, I never actually admitted that I wanted to work in food and have like a real profession doing this. I think because like I had dedicated so much of my life to design and making architecture my career path, and I think food was just always seen as like a hobby, something that made me really happy, and I wasn't really ever sure if that was an actual like yeah career that I could be financially stable from and things like that. And so I think I took those experiences as kind of like moments that made me really happy and creatively fulfilled. And it wasn't until I started working in architecture professionally where I found like a void in creativity and was like, I need to do something else. And I did not like, oh, I'm gonna start a supper club again. Like that felt like a little too much for me. I just like I bought a URL and I just started posting on it um every week. And and I think what I was really drawn to is how like just on the blog or just having any type of media platform, like everything that you share is a moment. It's a moment based on like knowledge and craft and like you have your food to show for it. And so they were kind of like I don't know, like miniature experiences compared to like my dinner parties and things like that. They're just a lot more
Right.
manageable to produce and share with the world.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a perfect segue for what I want to dive into next. 'Cause later on in the book, you talk about how you moved to San Francisco, specifically the inner Richmond, close to Clement.
Mhm.
Love that area. I'm born and
Mhm.
raised in SF, so
Okay.
the gold mine of Asian cuisine here in Bay Area. I love Clement Street. And during this time, you described being frustrated with the job as an architect and wanting to have a more creative outlet, as you were explaining, right? Buying this domain and starting the blog Eat Your Food. So, what was your goal of the blog at this time?
My goal for the blog was to just fulfill my, I think the void that I mentioned before of being creatively fulfilled. I found that like every recipe kind of like stretched my, I don't know, like my culinary creative muscles in some way. I was really into photography. Um, and I think there was a lot of crossover between my job and, like, kind of the food that I was creating on there. Like, I was paying attention to, like, colors and textures, and then, like, in photography, how things are arranged and composed, and, like, the writing aspect. And I think at the time, like, no one was really reading it other than, like, my mom and maybe my fiance's mom. And so, like, maybe I also had a goal that, like, someone else would be interested in reading, but it had very, very humble beginnings. Again, I don't think I ever expected to be able to do this as a full-time job. So I still don't really believe it now.
And I was going to say, I love your blog. So it definitely has reached a lot of people, including myself, and it's changed the way that we look at baking and cooking, especially with Chinese cuisine. So big
Oh,
thank
thank
you
you
for
so
that.
much.
And then also, you mentioned in the book that you transferred your design approach from architecture to photography, food styling, and dumpling pleats. That
Mhm.
was very fascinating to me. So, when did you realize that you could use techniques to learn that you learned from architecture classes for your cooking?
Yeah, I think like in architecture, like your architecture is really just about problem solving in like a visual way, or like your final product is pretty visual. And this can be applied to like any other, I feel like, design profession too. Like you have like you start with like a concept and then you iterate or also generate how you're actually going to produce your concept.
Hmm.
And through general practice and iteration, you like tweak things, just kind of like recipe testing, you know? And then the
Yeah.
final thing, you want it to be visual and if that's important to you. And so I think with like food, like a lot of my recipe ideas, like sometimes they'll be a lot more clear, but sometimes in the middle of the night, I'm like, oh, I think I'm just making something up right now. It's like, what if like celery and black bean sauce and like something else just is together? Like there's like a string of like a few ingredients, and then and I take that like very basic concept later and then iterate it and then like slowly form it into something that looks appetizing and looks like something that would
Mhm.
make like a dynamic dish in a photo, and make people want to actually eat it and make it. And so I think the fundamental steps there are very much the same. And I've spoken to a few different cookbook authors, and we all kind of like work differently. But I think that I do have a very strong correlation with how like I used to approach problems in my last job and how I work now in food.
Awesome. Yeah, and what advice would you give someone who's thinking about turning their culinary passions, like what you did, into a
Mhm.
career?
I think so. I have two important, like I guess, points of advice. The first one is just start sharing. I think it even happened to me when I was first creating my blog. Like I kind of just like I didn't want to share. I had gotten the URL and was like generating all this stuff, but I just like didn't want to share it because I felt like it wasn't like perfect enough. And I wish I just started doing it earlier. Honestly, I think that like the more you share, like the first thing that you share is never going to be like perfect in any sense, like
Mhm.
even throughout the entire journey. But like the more you share, the more you get into the practice of sharing and creating and then also honing in on your voice. And that goes to my second point that like
Yes.
once you kind of make that mental decision to like, I'm going to try and pursue this, just like with any big project, whether it's like a business plan or anything like that, to have an objective or like your mission statement in a sense, like what am I about,
Right.
what is my food about, and try to make it a little bit more meaningful and a little bit more thoughtful than like I want to make food that performs well, like because like
Yeah.
so much of food media is like based on these like statistics and things like that, and like I feel like I've tried to like not that I don't care, but I try to not to make that like the main reason why I create something, you know? Just have a little bit more, yeah, heart behind why you're creating a dish to share.
I really like that. Have a little more
Yeah.
heart. We all need a little
Yeah.
more heart in what we do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then, so what advice would you give someone who wants to pursue a culinary career but doesn't want to follow the traditional culinary school path?
I yeah, so I did not go to culinary school as I mentioned, I went to architecture school instead.
Mhm.
So I guess like my only culinary training ever was just like maybe just like through osmosis and growing up in my family's restaurant and learning how to cook from my parents. But I think that there's a lot of ways for you to kind of like break into the culinary world without going a traditional path. Like I write for home cooks, and I think I benefit from that, from
Mm.
being a home cook myself, you know? So, it kind of ties back to like what I said in the last question, but like just to start and like start sharing it in a way that makes sense to you, whether it's a blog or maybe you make super easy recipes that you can share just like in a video or newsletter. I think those are all very like approachable and also like financially easy. Like you don't, it doesn't really cost much to like just like post something on the internet and see what people do with it.
Mhm.
So I think just to start sharing and get comfortable writing.
Yes. Okay. So speaking of posting videos, right, and posting them on the internet, how does a home cook start their social media journey? How was your experience, starting an Instagram, not only just a blog, but Instagram, which I feel is more intimate and more engaging sometimes, especially from peer to peer?
hmm I think you can try to come up with like a memorable name or just use your name, I guess. But I think people tend to, it's just easier to latch on to someone or a brand or a concept if you have like a name that kind of sticks out. And so I think a lot of people like eat Cho Food, although it takes some people like a little bit of time to
I
like kind
love
of
it.
get the pun, you know? They're like, "Oh, your last name's Cho. I get it now." And yeah, like sign up. I feel like I've had all these things for so long. I can't even remember like the act of actually doing this. Like I think I created my Cho Food Instagram in like 2016, which like feels like a lifetime ago. So like if Instagram's your thing, just start an account there. You can keep it separate or make it your personal one. Or if TikTok's your thing, like I feel like an old person, but like I did start TikTok last year. And it's a whole new world out there, you know? So yeah, just start, create something, see what happens.
Lovely. So thank you so much for explaining that. And now I'd really like to talk about the research and documentation you've done for Chinese bakers. Me being a researcher myself, this was also one of my favorite aspects of your cookbook because you really brought those bakers to life. You
Mhm,
described that after talking with the bakery professionals from across the country, you noticed that they all came from different origins, different career paths, and different business styles. And one of my favorite parts is when you explain what connects them is a true passion for feeding people exceptional food and dedication to wholesome ingredients and the virtues of making dishes from scratch and skipping shortcuts. Wow, like
mhm,
one of my favorite sentences I read. um, in return, each had built like a loyal customer base spanning generations. So,
mhm.
from your experience interviewing these people, what were some of your favorite Chinese bakery origin stories that you heard?
Yeah. So before I get into it, so like it was really important for me to include these bakery features. I've heard from a lot of people that they weren't necessarily expecting that out of a cookbook. But I think because this was the first like main or like English language focused cookbook um, on Chinese baking, I wanted to include like I always like humanity, you know, like there are people that have been running these bakeries, creating our favorite buns and pastries for decades. And for someone that might not know much about Chinese baking, I wanted to make that like very clear that this is a part of Chinese American, like Chinese history, and it's not something that's like brand new with like I don't know, like fancy new bakeries or anything like that. And so it was really important for me to highlight these bakeries. Um, when I first started working on the book, so I started working on it in like January 2020. And my mom and I were actually supposed to travel to a few different cities in America to try out to just go to bakeries, talk to them, and things like that. I wanted to bring my mom with me because my Cantonese is
Oh.
not great. And so I wanted to bring my mom's great. And I wanted to bring her with me to also just like she gets anyone to talk to her, you know? And I found
Mhm.
that when I was just kind of going to bakeries already by myself, a lot of times they're a little like suspicious of me. I was like, I'm not asking for recipes. I just just like I just want to know your story. And so we were supposed to do that, and we were trying to focus on like kind of mid-level or mid-sized cities, kind of like Cleveland where we lived. Like we are gonna go to like Houston um and like maybe Albuquerque or Santa Fe or something like that. I don't remember. But then
Mhm.
the pandemic happened, so we couldn't travel. And so I had to switch gears. I kind of held off on the interviews for a few months just to see what was happening. Like, I think we were all just like, when is this going to end? Am I ever going to be able to travel
Yeah.
again? And then as I was approaching my manuscript deadline, I'm like, okay, like, I need to figure out how to get like these interviews in there. And so I just started calling bakeries. Since I live in the Bay Area, it was very easy for me to go to Eastern Bakery, which was the San Francisco bakery that I
Yeah.
featured for. So that was really easy. But I wanted to include other cities. And so I was calling up, emailing all these different bakeries. Like no one was responding to me. Again, I think Asian people are just like, they're a little like suspicious of like how media or I don't know how things can affect their business and stuff like that. So I understand that. But it was actually ironic that the three other bakeries that were willing to talk to me had been around for such a long time and were very
Mm.
connected to their communities. And I think that had some correlation with their openness with wanting to share their story. Um, and so with Los Angeles, I was able to speak with the daughter of the owner or the founder of Phoenix
Oh.
Bakery, which is one of the oldest,
Mm.
if not the oldest bakery in Los Angeles. In New York, I spoke with the daughter of the founder of Fei Da, which I think started in the early 90s, I believe, or maybe late 80s. And they're just like prolific. Like they have so many locations. Like they're not a nationwide chain, but like they have so many locations in the New York City area. Like I think they're up to like 14 now. And then I found like almost like a hole in the wall. It was so different than all the other bakeries that I was able to talk to. But I found Ray's Cafe in Philadelphia, which the owner is like from Taiwan, but she's like obsessed with making coffee, and she essentially makes coffee in like a third wave style, but also serves Taiwanese like beef noodle soup and dumplings, and also has like cookies and cakes. It was like I was like, this is such an interesting perspective of what like could be defined as a Chinese bakery. So I wanted to highlight that as well. And they are sort of like an institution in the Philadelphia area. Like it's just like a stop that people would go to in the morning to get coffee. And so it's hard for me to pick one, but like I loved all their stories and how they were different. But as you said, or as you recited from from my book, they have this like kind of like thread that connects all of them. Like they consistently produce great quality food and provide like a sense of community for their community, like a physical space for them to go to and add just like a little bit of, I don't know, I would say like joyfulness to their day just by stopping by.
Oh, yes, and absolutely. I mean, I go to Eastern Bakery. I try to at least every Sunday if I get the chance. The line
Yeah.
isn't too long.
Yeah. Yeah. Not too long.
That's awesome. And so you also mentioned like the types of bakeries in your book, the grab and go, specialty shops, takeaway, and
Hmm.
sit down cafes.
Hmm.
Which ones are some of your favorites? Do you have a preference?
Yeah, so I talk about it all the time, but like living on or well, almost Clement Street. I lived like one block away from Clement Street. And I would walk around the corner and go to Good Luck Dim Sum like every
Mhm.
every week, if not multiple times a week. I would stop there before getting on the bus to go to work. But that is one of my favorite kind of like grab and go takeaway dim sum bakery places. I love that. And then also on Clement Street, there's a Harvest Wheat Field there, which is like a very classic, um, classic Chinese bakery. So I felt very lucky to have so many great options on Clement Street within walking distance from my house. But yeah, it was also important for me to kind of like highlight like the different ways that a Chinese bakery could be presented, you know, like the different typologies. I think a lot of people immediately create this image of just like the classic ones that are like the glass or acrylic cases, like rows and rows of them, and you grab like a tray and a pair of tongs and you just kind of like load it up, you know, like that is a very classic Chinese bakery. But all these things also exist in like a slightly different environment, like the takeaway style that you can also get like at Good Luck Dim Sum, you can get like all the dim sum classics like Siu Mai Ha Gao, you can get Juk there. But then they also have buns, you know, like they have like all of like the great sweet things there too. And then of course you can get it like at a restaurant, like at a Hong Kong cafe or at a dim sum actual restaurant. So I think that's probably one of the greatest things about Chinese bakeries is that if you find one that also has all the savory things, you can get everything that you love like all in one place.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of my favorite parts about it as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Stop shop.
Yeah.
So in talking about those different shops, especially those bakeries, how do the restaurant owners decide what kind of bakery to open?
I mean, I feel like I probably asked the owners when I did that. I think a lot of them kind of gravitate towards like maybe the grab and go because it's like people can like meaning customers can actually like do a lot of the work for them, you know, like picking and choosing. There's not so much like putting an order in and stuff. But I think a lot of the owners, I actually talked to a few of the owners and asked them like why they chose a bakery versus a restaurant. And it was just kind of like 50-50 split, which I was actually sort of surprised by. I felt like more people would have maybe considered going into a restaurant. But for them, like, and I think for a lot of them, they had like something in their past that like really kind of drew them towards like working in a bakery, like at Fei Da, like he like apprenticed as a baker, like I think he might have been from Taiwan, but you know, he had a little bit of like a background in that too. Or like another one, like just loved, like just prefers cake, you know, like prefers like sweet things. And so they just gravitate towards that instead. And I think another factor in deciding like how they're going to structure their business or how it's going to operate really just depends on like the climate, like the time that you started it, like what the community is like. If there is like a big Chinatown, like I feel like there's a big difference between like a business that's starting in Cleveland, Ohio, where I'm from. Like we didn't have a bakery for decades. Like the bakery that we have now opened in like 2005 or something. And then compare that to like Los Angeles that has like, or San Francisco that has like deep roots in like very old Chinatowns, you know? And so they kind of have like a little bit of everything. And so I think it just depends on the context of where they're located.
Nice. And then do you know, is there like an average or a magic number for how many members usually work in a Chinese bakery and like what the roles are?
Again, I think it goes bakery by bakery. So like Fei Da, because they have so many locations, they obviously have like staff that runs individual ones, but they do have like a manufacturing or like a main bakery hub that creates like their dough. And I saw like I saw photos of like their assembly line or just like the machines that like produce like the tons and tons of dough that they need to make all of like the buns that go to all their 14 different locations. But then like Eastern Bakery is like just that one bakery in San Francisco, Chinatown. I think they like Orlando is the owner. And he's like always kind of like the first person that you see there. And I think his wife might be there too. And I think I only have like a handful of bakers that work there during the bakery shift. They're never there when I'm there because I stop at like a reasonable hour, like in the afternoon or something. So they're not there when I'm there. Yeah. But I think I think it can vary. A lot of times it's like very much like a family operation. But if you get on Fei Da level, you know, you got to expand a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. And then going to a different section of your cookbook. So I also really love the how to shop at Asian grocery store section in your cookbook. It's awesome. I also reference it to a lot of my non-Asian friends. So why did you add this section to your cookbook?
Yeah, I honestly, I kind of debated whether or not I wanted to add this, because as an author, and also like as a first time author, I was like really trying to like figure out who am I writing this book for, and that's so hard to pinpoint because you can't control like who is interested in this book, who's going to pick it up. And so I felt
Right.
like I had like a few different I had like people who maybe like other Asian Americans that grew up with these types of baked goods and are very comfortable going to like an 99 ranch or something like that. But then
Hmm.
I also know a lot of people like even within my own family because like I was just home and I was just kind of like reflecting about how much my family really wanted to be American as much as they could. Like I was asking my mom like why did you make this recipe like when you were 12 years old? And she's like I just
Mm.
wanted to try American food. Like we're in America, I just wanted to do this. And like I fully realize that or and understand that there are other Asian Americans out there that are still learning about their Asianness, you know?
Yeah.
And I wanted to be welcoming to that, like if a grocery store like this overwhelms you, but you see your mom, like maybe you're only used to going there with your mom or your grandma or something like that. And you only know a few packages of the different ingredients that you like, and you go there for the first time alone, it could be overwhelming. Like I have felt that before. And so I kind of wrote that for them. And then I also wrote it for people who have no idea what any of this stuff is. Like I was trying to have like a little bit of everything for everyone because I just want everyone to feel comfortable and welcomed and comfortable when they open my
Mhm.
book and try to decide what they're going to make. And so a lot of times that journey starts at an Asian grocery store to get a few things, but not everything. I think a lot of the recipes you can make without actually going to an Asian grocery store.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, um, are there specific types of ingredients that like you just have to go to an Asian grocery store for, or like what are some of the hardest ingredients to find for
Mhm.
some of the recipes?
Um, so I think there's only like a handful of things that would be like you would have to plan to specifically make this recipe and like, oh, I need to
Mhm.
get like red beans or red bean paste or make your own red bean paste by getting dried red beans at the Asian grocery store or getting like kanaka, which is like a Japanese soybean powder. Um, but and maybe like grass jelly. Like there's like a few things that you really need to go there
Mhm.
for. But like the milk bread recipe, which is like the base for so many of these recipes, you can just get all that stuff at the most normal grocery store anywhere. And I think that is pretty powerful that like this literally the foundation of like Chinese milk bread, all the buns that are you find at the bakery, like anyone can make it literally. There is nothing holding you back um,
Mhm.
from creating it yourself.
Yeah, definitely. And this is a great segue. So, speaking of making milk bread and making bread, you also mentioned in the book that you cook by instinct,
Mhm,
but that you also love the methodical process of making bread.
mhm.
What is the methodical part of making bread that you love so much?
Sure. We kind of talked about it actually before about how like you might be more of a cook, versus like
Oh,
a
yes.
baker. And there's definitely like a different mindset for both. And I'm one of like the weird people that like I feel comfortable doing both, but you do have to kind of like switch gears just a little bit. Like, yes, cooking is like super like it can be really intuitive and you can always correct things throughout the process. And with baking, like it's a little hard to correct because you don't quite know how something is going to behave until you take it out of the oven and see what it looks like. But I think what's really comfortable or what's really satisfying about baking is that you do have all these kind of like rules. Like if you mix these things together, this will happen. There's like kind of these
Mhm.
like predictable outcomes through baking. And then the methodical process of like you do this step first and this next, to kind of create that outcome. Like I like that. I like my mind, like I find that really satisfying to kind of figure out all those steps. But then I think once you become like a comfortable baker, then you get this like kind of like baking intuition. Like everyone says baking's a science, yes, but that doesn't mean you only have to do the recipe as it's prescribed forever, if that makes sense. Like there is creativity in baking, of course. Like for the milk bread recipe, like you can like I encourage people to like make the base milk bread a few times. It's like it has yeast in it, so it's like a living, breathing thing, and it behaves differently in everyone's kitchen based on like the temperature, the humidity, and things like that. So once you get comfortable with your base milk bread, you know how to make it in your own kitchen, then you can start like adding like different additives to it. Other like if it's in the dough, like I've made like a sweet potato milk bread. I've experimented making this like basil puree to add in there to make a really pretty basil milk bread. But then with the fillings too, you know, like at some point you should feel confident to kind of like make it your own and like riff on it a little bit.
Yeah, awesome, fantastic. And then also you mentioned on your blog that you teach dumpling classes. So what are some of your favorite memories teaching?
Yeah, so I used to teach dumpling classes a lot. I don't teach them quite as much anymore. Unless it's for like an event. I actually reserve them for like fundraisers. Like that's when
Awesome.
I bring it out again. But I started teaching dumpling classes when I first like left my job in architecture to do this full time. I actually taught them like pretty frequently, like monthly. But some of my so a general favorite memory is when people can actually make the dumplings. Like it's just really satisfying, like after teaching them and showing them the steps of like folding to see someone actually get it. Like I think that's probably why people like who are teachers love to be teachers, you know, like it's like, yes, like I was able to communicate and show something in a proper way for someone else to do it. Another favorite memory, which is like not a well, it's a positive memory, but I was teaching, it was my first time teaching crystal dumplings, which are like hagao, like the when the dough is like made out of starch, like a blend of starches. And I was teaching that for the first time. It wasn't a huge class, but if you ever made crystal dumpling dough before, it's like very temperamental. Like the water needs to be really hot. Otherwise, it goes a little crazy and the starches don't like gelatinize the right way. And I was like doing my spiel in the beginning like a little too long, and I think my water cooled down too much. And so when I added it to it and I was like mixing it up, my dough wasn't coming together. It was like the weirdest, it was like flubber, like it was moving by itself. Like I had it in one hand and it was just like it was like a waterfall, like it would not stop moving. It was like so strange. And I was like, I need to make this again. So so everyone in the class was like very patient with me, and it just gave me a few extra minutes to remake the crystal dumpling dough with hot boiling water, and it turned out great. If anything, it turned out to be a pretty good like teaching moment so that people could know what happens if your water isn't hot enough.
Awesome. That's also a great reference to flubber.
Yeah. The only time I ever talk about flubber is when I tell that story. So.
Awesome. Okay. Well, so before we wrap things up here, you do mention you're working on your next cookbook. Can you tell us anything about it? Any sneak peeks? If not, no worries though.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm working on a second cookbook. There will be like a dessert section, but it is primarily a savory cookbook, which I thought would be easier, but it's actually not now that I'm in the process of writing it. But when I say what the book's about, you're like, it's not all cookbooks, but it is a book about family style cooking and how to bring like your favorite loved ones and family, anyone, to the table, which like all cookbooks are kind of like that, but it's more inspired by like how my family cooked for each other. Like I love a good dinner party, but like I feel like dinner parties get a connotation of being like they're very like curated, you know, like you're playing like maybe you write you like hand write a menu and there's like candles everywhere and stuff, but like my parents never did that, and they would have lots of like pretty much my whole mom's side of the family lives in Cleveland, and I was just there. Like everyone just comes over for dinner, and it's like the best food. It's like the best food ever. And so I'm just trying to channel that energy into this book.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I'm excited for that. Can't wait.
Yeah.
so much for answering my questions, Kristina. It's been fantastic getting to know more about you, your origins, and your work. Now it looks like we have a couple questions here. So let's go ahead and see the first question. Is there a particular recipe you recommend for first-time bakers?
Yeah. So let me pull it up in the book. So I always recommend if you're, I opened immediately to it. So I highly recommend making these crispy Chinese sausage and cilantro pancakes. So they're just like my kind of like my variation on the classic green onion pancake. And I think this recipe is great. You're not actually baking anything. It's actually like a skillet cooked bread. But I think that this recipe is really great for a beginner or novice baker that isn't comfortable with dough right away. Because so much of baking, especially bread making, is making sure your dough is well hydrated. It should feel a certain way and act a certain way. And what makes this recipe so easy is that the dough is not leavened, but still you get to learn like what a well hydrated dough should feel like, how to stretch it, giving and like learning the idea of giving your dough patience, like letting it rest a little bit if you're kind of shaping it into different things. Like especially with the milk bread, I share a bunch of different shapes that you can like form it into for the different buns. So yeah, the pancakes are like a low risk intro to working with dough.
Awesome, great. Here's another question from Alyssa. Are there any baking trends that interest you these days? What do you see that you are curious / excited about?
Yeah, let's see. There's so much. I feel like the internet, well, the internet can be like overwhelming, but I think right now, at least in the Bay Area, I love that there's like so many of these kind of like hybrid Asian French bakeries going on. Like there's like I think Sunday Bake Shop and like and the other one I can't remember. But I think that's really fascinating. I am also like kind of experimenting, like I've been making this like laminated milk bread to make like croissants and things with. And so I think a trend that I see all like everywhere right now is like there's so many new flavor combinations and ingredients that you can add into like a laminated dough and have like the craziest croissant of your life. So that's really exciting.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. I also am very stoked about that combination that's been happening in the Bay.
Yeah, it's awesome.
All right, great. The next question here we have from Casey. She says, "Hi, Kristina. I'm a novice baker who started dabbling in Asian recipes. I've seen many recipes that use bread flour instead of regular flour or vice versa. In your opinion, which one is better?"
Sure. Neither one is better. They are just different. And into the mix of that, there's also cake flour. And so I think and I tried my best to explain this in the recipes, like, or in the kind of like the front matter of the book, the difference of these flours. So like they all have different protein contents. And so bread flour tends to have the highest one, and cake flour has the least. And protein content affects kind of the gluten formation in your bread. And so for the milk bread recipe, it's very important to use bread flour because it has a high protein content, makes strong gluten formation in your bread. Milk bread is like a really enriched dough, meaning there's a lot of fat in it. Like there's eggs, there's butter, and then there's of course like the milk in there, and all that stuff tends to like weigh down whatever you're baking. And so if you had swapped out like all-purpose flour in the milk bread, you would still get a tasty bread, but it's just not going to be that like as light or as light or as airy. It's going to be weighed down by all of those like enriched ingredients. And so that's why you use it for that. However, for like a recipe like dumpling dough or the green onion pancake dough, I would just use all-purpose flour in that because it's like a very like you're not too concerned about like the rise or stretch of that dough. Like all purpose is totally fine. And then cake flour is great for things that you want to be like a little bit more tender, like of course cake. Like the sponge cake recipe, I use it in there because you want it to be like as delicate and like cotton candy like texture as you can.
Wonderful. That's awesome. That's great to know.
Yeah. So try not to swap. If you have a trusted recipe that tells you to use that kind of flour, just try to find that flour and use
it. Great. I think we got about a couple more questions lined up here. I think we'll take maybe one or two more questions. The next one is from Hung. Hi, Kristina. Thank you for joining us today. Is there a chef or a celebrity you dream of collaborating with?
Let's see. I would like, let's see. So I was a big like Food Network kid when I was growing up.
Yes.
My mom watched it all the time, and I feel like I would be happy meeting anyone from Food Network right now. But I would love to be invited over to Ina Garten's house for lunch. I just want to be there. So she would be an amazing person to collaborate with.
Yes, absolutely. I'm right there with you. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, the comedian Ali Wong, she loves Good Luck Dim Sum, and I swear she was like there the day after I was, and I was like, no, like, so I would also love to collaborate with her somehow.
Oh, I think that could happen. I could see it happening. All right, I think we got one last question here. This one is from Benjamin. He says, hello, Kristina. Hope you're doing well, and thanks for doing this talk. If you were allowed to eat only one item whenever you visit a Chinese cafe / bakery for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Oh my God. This question's gonna like haunt me for the rest of my life. I don't know. It's so hard. Like, it's so hard because I have to choose between sweet and savory, you know, like so difficult.
Maybe we could do one for savory, one for sweet.
Okay. That'll make my life easier. For a sweet thing, I would just eat an egg tart. Just like a classic Cantonese style egg tart with a flaky pastry. That's what I would eat for sweet at any Chinese bakery. I sort of already do that as like just like a gauge to see how good the bakery is, like based on their egg tart. And then for savory, it would probably be a hot dog bun of some sort, whether it's in a flower shape or a different shape. I just want a hot dog bun. Yeah.
Yes, right. I'm right there with you. With
yeah.
Oh my gosh, nothing like a flaky crust.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think we're wrapped up with all the questions here. Lastly, I did want to ask, like, do you have any advice for someone that you could give who wanted to make a cookbook?
Who wants to make a cookbook? Yeah. So I think when I first pitched my cookbook in 2019, it wasn't even that long ago. I feel like there was this kind of like unnecessary connotation or like just thought that like we didn't need more Asian American focused cookbooks and that there was like enough. Like I think a lot of publishers are like, oh, I got one title for the year. Like we don't need more than that. And because this is I think this is a primary Asian or AAPI group, but I think there are so many stories within our community to share. And if there is a story or a facet about your family, your food, and you really, really believe in it, I think there's going to be other people that relate to it too. So don't like buy into the idea that we don't need more Asian American cookbooks because we do.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kristina, for joining us and for everyone tuning into this Talks at Google episode. I hope you have a great rest of your week. And I can't wait for the next cookbook to come out.
Thanks. Next year.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you, everybody.